everyone. Today I've got a couple of drawing lessons for you. The first one, we are going to be using one of our blind contours that has thicker lines, or that you could use your ink values on. And then I do an example of a thinner line blind contour where I use my graphite pencils to learn more about creating gradients. So let's get into it. Here I am just creating some hatching lines. For this sixth and last sphere, I'm going to be doing some cross hatching. So you can see in all the spheres here, I have left out the lightest light part, which is the center light, and there is a light area around it, but not near so light. The center light, it is the white of the paper. Everything else should be some variation of gray. When I'm doing my hatching, I start in patches, kind of. I go in one direction and then I change the angle slightly. So one tip that my drawing teacher gave me when I was about your guys' age is that when you're doing hatching, you don't want to only go perpendicular because those two angles that are contradictory to one another can kind of compete in a way that will not create a very blended gradient. And that's ultimately what we're going for here, is practicing blending gradients. So for my first sphere, you can see at the very top, I did some scumbling techniques by using wavy lines. And then for my second sphere, I did some lines that vary in thickness that are kind of similar to hatching. They all go one direction, but that to create that shadow, that they vary in thickness and in density. And then for the third sphere, I did dots only, which is stippling. And then for my fourth sphere, I just wrote down words to songs, words that I was thinking of, words that I could think of quickly, pretty much. I could be more meaningful about it. I saw somebody that did a portrait of a friend in honor of them, and that they had written all words that described that person, and I felt like that was very, very sweet energy. But my fifth sphere, I am working on cross hatching. So you can see that I'm kind of turning my page to all go the same direction. And you know as well as I do that with ultra fine point Sharpie or Sharpie pen, you kind of get a dot when you first lay down the marker. So I kind of switch back and forth the point where my lines are originating from, so that area is in the darkest and most hidden spot of my sphere. And I'm making all of my shadows correlate to my spheres, but they don't have to exactly match. I've also been on all of my spheres saving a rim light. So the rim light is light that is casted back from the shadow itself, or from if it's sitting on a white table, that it will still have some light cast back. And then for my sixth sphere, which I kind of did those last two kind of out of order for some reason, that my sixth sphere, I did the 3 hatches next to each other, but I wanted to see if I could make it create a gradient by only changing the thickness of the 3 strikes or hatches. So I'm just going back and forth. So a huge amount of it is size and weight of line, and another amount of it is density of your lines. So with the lettering on number 4, it was good to make the letters bigger, closer to the area that is the lightest. That was something that really helped me. All right, so we should have 3 to 5 blind contour and contour line drawings. So that one was my contour drawing. These are two blind contour drawings where I used a thicker marker, and this one's another blind contour where I used a thinner marker. So for this first one, I'm going to use one with lots of heavy lines and a good composition. So it fills up the space really well. That I could have used any of mine that those would work. But this one I feel like has a lot of closed shapes, and that's something that I am looking for with this value project. So for this one, I am just practicing a variety of different techniques of how pattern is related to, because for my inquiry for this one, which does not have to be your inquiry for yours, I would recommend that you come up with your own. But for my inquiry with this project, I was thinking of how can value intersect with pattern. So for this one, I was thinking of how can I use lots of different patterns in this piece. And so with pattern, that you're thinking of, for mine, that they are isolated patterns that don't necessarily go together or wouldn't traditionally go together. So this one, I created some hatching above her eye. I was just thinking of areas where in my portrait there would be naturally some shadows. And so this right above her eye makes sense. So primarily for this part, I've just done some hatching and some stippling, and then now for the hair, I'm starting some scumbling, and I'm starting darker towards the part because I know that that is where the shadow usually is, and it can help make her hair look a little bit shiny. And that this part, I'm doing the part dark, and I'm just using hatching to shade it out so that it looks like it has some dimensionality here. And I am being careful of my edges and trying not to go over the lines, that with my craftsmanship. Now I'm choosing other closed shapes that would, with added value, help balance out my composition. So whatever it is that you're exploring with this piece and creating value and practicing ink studies and experimenting, so that is where you will come up with your inquiry for your process portfolio. That this is something that you should be thinking about while you're creating, that it shouldn't necessarily be after the fact. So for mine, that the pattern question of how pattern and value can influence one another is born out of looking at what I was creating with the spheres and knowing what I needed to do. So your inquiry could be related to composition, it could be related to creating balance or an emotion, it could be related to blind contour in and of itself or other observational drawing studies. It's really up to you of what you want your inquiry to be made into.
I said the things you want me
And here is my finished ink study with the inquiry of where do pattern and values intersect. Now we are going to be starting off with one of our blind contour or contour line drawings. I chose this one because the lines are a little bit thinner. You can see I'm looking at some of my drawing pencils. I'm a big fan of 3B and 4B pencils, and so for a lot of my drawings I can get so hyper focused that I forget what kind of pencil I'm even using. And oftentimes it'll be a 3 or a 4B. This one's a harder lead pencil, just sometimes when I'm getting started and I don't want to push hard in an area, or if I'm still sketching something out, I will use a B or a 2B, which a 2B is pretty equivalent to your regular school pencil. So a number 2 pencil is about a 2B. So for this piece, I see here I am reaching for my 4B. At one point I use a 5B, and these brand of pencils that I'm using are not the greatest, and so my 5B of this brand feels almost harder than my 4B, which is not natural. That the higher number of B, the more brittle or soft your pencil is supposed to be. So I make his top lip darker because it is naturally darker, but for this piece I am practicing gradients, and that is something that I would like for you to do so that you can familiarize yourself in a more exploratory way your drawing pencils. So what we're doing is creating gradients, which gradients are a blend from light to dark or from one color to another color, so that there is not a seam necessarily. And for some of these shaded areas, that they're overlap of 2 images almost at once. So it reminds me of a trick in photography that is called double exposure. It's where you're seeing 2 images, 2 negatives that have been burnt into a photo image paper 2 different times or 2 different images at once, and it can create kind of some trick effects. So you can see that the shirt wrinkles that are, so that's his chin, he has kind of a cleft chin, and I shaded that in dark so that it stood out, and then his shirt wrinkles are what is coming through his lips, and so I wanted to show that really well. So my inquiry for this drawing piece is how technique is a common means of abstraction. One image. So I had a teacher that would set up a huge still life new in the middle of the drawing classroom, and then he'd have you draw a really realistic rendering of the still life, and then he'd have you outline it in Sharpie, and then he'd have you flip it upside down and then draw it again on top of itself. So that seeing something twice and then shading it after the fact, now that the forms were almost unrecognizable, was a really interesting practice of composition. So for myself in this piece, I don't have to know what objects are what to be able to do some shading. Here I am doing shading on his hair. It is one of the only things that I shade as if I know what it is and I'm trying to give it texture. That I feel like this is one of this model's defining features, is how he does his hair, and so I wanted to make that at the forefront of the subject and maybe one of the focal points, if not the eyes. That I'm creating some details here in his ear, but not too much, just enough to help you know that it's an ear, and to help you set some things aside. So because I have captured so much detail here, it just is not necessarily in the proper order, and might be a little bit confusing to the viewer, but I know I was not confused in my creation of this piece, was that I was able to track and follow and knew that I was documenting everything all at once. It didn't matter that I wasn't documenting it in the right order, and therefore it shouldn't matter to me now. I'm going in and just shading things that will help my composition to stand out. If I shaded the whole thing in gray, it wouldn't have very much contrast. So it's important that I leave some areas of this piece white. And here is my second finished piece. Great job today, you all. Be sure that you hit turn in on Google Classroom and that you save images for your process portfolio. See you next time.